Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing blocks 11 and 12 of the mystery quilt Happiness is Homemade. I thought we'd start off this week by taking a look at all of the pieces up on the design wall. So let's move you over and take a look at all of the blocks from the beginning of this series up until today. I think it's a running total as far as my favorite block being the cookie jar and the coffee block. Love to hear from you down in the comments section. Which one is your favorite out of all the blocks we've done so far? Now, before we dive into this week's blocks, I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. Several of you are so new to Applique, and I'm so proud of you for following along in this series. Several of you I've heard from have never done Applique and are on the fence about tackling this quilt. Just want to let you know. Block 11 is probably the most difficult block in this whole quilt series, only because of the detailed cutting and the time involved in sewing the applique pieces down. I'm going to share some tips that will speed up and make this block so much easier in just a little bit, so stay tuned. Do not get discouraged when you see this block. Before we move on with today's blocks, if this is the first time you've ever joined any of my videos, I'm so glad you're here. Would love it if you subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you get notified when I make new videos. Also remember that there is a playlist for this whole series in the description box below. You can start from the very beginning of this series and catch up, do a little binge watching over the holidays. Also, just to let you know, before we get started today, this will be the last video until January the 10th. We're going to take a little Christmas vacation. We're going to get rested and spend time with family and friends. Come back refreshed, renewed, and ready to create in the new year. So, put on your creative caps and let's move over to this week's blocks. So here we are with blocks 11 and 12. This week in the Etsy listing, you'll find 5 different listings. You'll have 2 separate PDFs, one for block 11, which is Happiness is Homemade, and one for block number 12. You'll notice block number 12, we're actually making 2 blocks. Yes, 2 blocks. So this week we're actually making 3 blocks, but I wanted to include the heart blocks as one block unit. 2 separate blocks. Surprise! So let's go ahead and take a look at these patterns. Now, I mentioned week number 11 is probably going to be the most difficult block of this whole entire quilt series, only because there's so many letters, detailed cutting, which is time consuming, can be hard on your fingers and your hands, and the stitching of your applique. So I wanted to share a tip with you. If you're completely new to applique, and this block here is going to be something that deters you from making this quilt, here's something that would help. I'm going to share a picture here of a product called Heat and Bond Ultra Hold, I believe. And this is actually a permanent adhesive. You use it in the same manner as your Heat and Bond Light. It gets ironed to the back side of your fabric when you trace and cut out your pieces and you fuse them to your background. That is all you have to do. There's no top stitching required. And so if doing a satin stitch or a free motion stitch or any other kind of stitch to sew down your applique pieces is something that's going to stop you from doing this quilt, maybe consider using a fusible product like this. That only will save a lot of time, but it also save a little bit of stress when it comes time to doing the stitching of your applique pieces. Also, I wanted to share this suggestion. Maybe you want to change out from doing Happiness is Homemade, all of these letters, and maybe add something of your own in this block, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith or Welcome Home, something that's a little bigger and easier to cut and stitch down, and something that customizes the quilt for you. So that might be something to consider. I hope you feel free to take the creative liberty enough to change this block if you wanted to. But let's go ahead and take a look at the pieces. For block 11, there are 2 SVG files, And so if you're getting the SVG files, there's 2 for block 11. If you're cutting out these pieces by hand, you can just leave those SVG files right with Etsy. There's no need to download those. So of course, the first sheet tells you the measurements of your sashing and your background piece. And then just like always, your letters are mirror imaged and ready to trace. And then there's 3 pages of letters. Okay, so that's block 11. And then for block number 12, we've split it up because we're doing 2 blocks. You'll notice this one says upper. That is going to be for the bigger of the 2 blocks, your measurements for sashing and the background. Then on page 2 of this PDF, this is for the lower block. And this one's a little bit smaller, so make sure you check out your measurements on the first page. And then there is one template to trace. You're going to cut out all 6 hearts exactly the same size. There's one SVG file for this. I've laid out 6 hearts, and so you're ready to start cutting if you're using a cutting machine with the SVG. So there are our pieces, and I hope I've given you a couple of helpful tips if you see this block and you're totally intimidated. I like to make my projects something that even someone who is absolutely new to the process of quilting and applique, something that you can do and follow along. So remember, the Ultra Bond hold, it's in the red package, Heat and Bond Light. That's permanent. There's no stitching down your pieces. Or feel free to take creative liberty and change this block to anything you'd like to put here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and show you my pieces for block 11 as we get started. Here are my background pieces and sashing. And then here are my pieces for block 11, the upper and lower blocks. All of those pieces are cut and ready to go. And this week, because we have so much detailed cutting, I sent everything over to the Brothers Scan and Cut out my pieces relatively quickly. It saved a ton of time. And so now I have all of my pieces ready and we're ready to move over to the iron. As we get started with block 11, this week I wanted to make sure that all of the applique was straight and on point centered in this block. So I'm going to take a ruler and a heat erasing pen and measure over 4 inches from the left and right and give myself some reference lines. And then I gave myself a straight line 2 inches from the bottom of this block. It's going to help me center all of my letters and make sure that each one of my letters is nice and straight all the way across my block. For the word homemade, I am overlapping where each letter ends and the next one starts, so it looks like one continuous word. And as I fuse these pieces down, all of my marks, my reference marks, will disappear. Now I can fuse down the word is right in the middle. And again, I'm going to give myself a reference line 1 3/4 inches from the top, and that is so that I can line up happiness nice and straight across the top. We'll get all of these letters nice and fused down. And let's take a good look at all of these applique pieces before we start stitching. Next, we'll move over to block 12, both individual blocks for block 12. I'm going to first start by doing a finger press right in the center of these blocks. That'll give me a reference mark to line up the very middle heart. And I want to make sure that they're all lined up with each other. So before I fuse them down, I'll make some adjustments. And then just quickly fuse everything into place. So let's finish up by taking a good look at the applique fused down onto our 2 individual blocks. And next we're going to move over to the sewing machine. This week, to speed up the process of sewing down all of my individual letters, I will be using my free motion foot. I'm using a green embroidery thread in the top and a black bobbin thread in the bottom, and I'm going to go around each one of my letters. I'll bring you along so that you can take a look at this process. You've seen it before in some previous blocks of this quilt. If you haven't tried this yet, I think you are going to find that it saves you so much time, and it's actually a lot of fun. It just takes a little bit of practice, but it's basically just like writing or drawing with a needle and thread. So I wanted to show you the letters P as I stitch around the inside loop-de-loop of the letter and do it all at the same time without breaking thread. Again, I'll show you with the letter A. Now, of course, you can use a satin stitch or a blanket stitch, whatever your preferred top stitch to sew down the applique. Feel free to change it up. I just think for me, it is so much easier and faster to do everything with my free motion foot. Next, I've switched over to a yellow top thread, and we'll stitch down the word is. Next, we're going to move down to the larger letters, the word handmade, and we're going to stitch all of this together because basically I want you to see the process of how I do this all in one continuous stitch. I'm not breaking thread whatsoever, and I'm going to run along the top side of all of my letters. I'll do my loop-de-loops first as I approach those, right along the inside, and then I'll travel right in that running stitch and move to the outside upper portion of the letter. I'll bring you along so that you can see this process. And as we finish the top portion of all the letters and all the loop-de-loops, we now are going right along the bottom edge of each one of the letters all the way back to the beginning. I also like to make sure that I stitch right over top of where each one of the letters is overlaid, just to make sure that little tiny raw edge is sewn down. And now we're just stitching all the way back to the very beginning where we started. And the last thing that we have left to do for this block is the great big letter H. I'll bring you along as I stitch this letter. And there we go. We are done stitching down what I believe, in my opinion, is probably the most difficult and time-consuming block of this whole entire quilt. Next, we're going to move over to the hearts. And for these blocks, I am going to do a blanket stitch. Change my thread, both the bobbin and the top thread, to a maroon embroidery thread. I'll bring you along as we do the first heart together. Coming down into this bottom point of the heart, I wanted to show you close up of where I stop right here at the very tip of the heart in the background fabric. Take one stitch over in the applique, and before we move, we're going to rotate the entire block around and continue stitching up the other side of the heart. Because I've done the blanket stitch so many times on this quilt, I actually feel like my blanket stitch has improved, so I'm excited about that. We'll work our way around the curvy part of the heart up at the top. And as we approach the center of the heart up at the top, we're going to come in closer so that you can see up close where I start and stop and rotate this block. Once your needle is right in that bottom point in the background fabric, rotate your heart, take one stitch over, and before you continue on, rotate the heart again and continue stitching. Just thought it might be helpful to actually show that part close up in case you've never done a blanket stitch before. That can sometimes be the trickiest part of doing any kind of top stitch when sewing down applique. Once I get back to where I started, I do continue on for a little bit beyond where I started stitching, and then I do a locking stitch and move on to the rest of the hearts. Once you're done stitching down all of your pieces, we can add some sashing. To block 11, you'll add the sashing to the bottom first and press that open and trim. And then you'll add your sashing to the left and right. And here is our finished block number 11. And for both blocks of number 12, you'll add the sashing to the bottom, press and trim. And then we're adding a sashing to the right side of each block. And here are our finished blocks for block number 12. Congratulations, you made it through probably the most difficult block in this series. I'd love to hear if you decide to do something different to block 11. I'd love to hear your plans if you plan to customize it in a different way. Certainly, I think the free motion foot and doing free motion stitching definitely speeds up the process. Also, if you have a cutting machine that can cut out all of those detailed letters, that would help so much. So I hope I've given you some helpful tips that make block 11 so much easier for you. So let's go ahead and take a look at our updated design wall. This is what the design wall looks like after we've added this week's blocks. I am absolutely loving this quilt. And even though we're taking a little bit of a break, I'm thinking we're going to come back refreshed. We're going to have 2 more weeks and we'll be doing blocks, let's see, 13 and 14 and then 15 and 16. Then we're going to take some time and put this quilt together. If you'd like to share pictures of your quilt's progress, you can email them to this email address, and I will be glad to share your pictures in a slideshow in upcoming mystery quilt videos. And until I see you on January the 10th, I hope you have an awesome Merry Christmas and a very safe and happy New Year. That's it. We're off to have a Christmas holiday. We'll see you all really soon and have fun creating. Bye.